In this chapter, we will discuss how sociologists study human behavior in society. We will look at the different types of research methods, how researchers decide what is the best method for their study, and the research process itself. There are several methods that sociologists use when they're doing research. Which method they choose depends on the study. We will talk research design in a little bit, so we'll talk about that. There are some methods in which researchers may not even interact with participants. They have an unobtrusive role during the research, where the researcher's presence is not felt and not known to the participants. This typically happens during survey research, typically when you get like a survey that you may fill out either online, sometimes they may mail you one, that type of thing. When you're using historical or archival documents or using existing data. So that may be stuff as far as use of official records or maybe past interviews. Then some researchers tend to have an obtrusive role during research. And this is when the researcher's presence is known during the research. And this will happen during participant observation and also during experiments. And we'll discuss all of these. Let's look at some historical information and kind of understand maybe the differences between the different types of research, qualitative and quantitative. And we'll talk more about that a little later on. But let's just get some historical information. Sociology at the University of Chicago began in the late 1920s, and it was extremely influential in shaping the discipline, in shaping American sociology. The sociologists, particularly Parks and Ogburn, felt that sociology should be more than just theoretical. Because before then, we had what were kind of seen as armchair theorists. They would sit and they would theorize about society and what was going on in society. But as far as getting out there and actually collecting data, as far as getting out there and actually analyzing the data and coming up with the findings to say, yes, this is what we're seeing, or to test the theories, that wasn't done a lot. And Park and Ogburn actually felt that it was important for sociologists to conduct research. Now, one of the things that's interesting with them is that they felt that research should be conducted in their neighborhoods. They were at the University of Chicago, so for them, that meant that they wanted to research what was actually going on in Chicago. Parks and Ogburn actually had two different views on the way to collect research. Parks thought it was important for sociologists to conduct research within the city to find out what was going on as far as meeting with people that lived in the neighborhood, talking with them, interviewing them, basically observing them, that type of thing. And so thus he used, once again, that city of Chicago as kind of the laboratory. Ogburn, on the other hand, wanted sociology to look more like the natural sciences. Ogburn believed that sociologists could study anything that could be measured with numbers. They both argue that sociological research must be rooted in scientific principles and practices. However, they looked at two different ways. Parks was more interested in the qualitative side, which meant that he was examining the personal, emotional, and scientific side of sociology and developing explanations about the social world. That would be considered qualitative, which goes closely with symbolic interaction. Actually, I should say closely goes with symbolic interaction. While Ogburn examined the social world through statistics and used scientific methodology for understanding the world, or the quantitative side, which typically works more with macro sociology because you're looking at the larger picture, you're looking at large numbers or large data sets in order to understand that. When sociology began its discipline, it was an extremely theoretical field. It consisted of, as I mentioned before, armchair speculation, and many of the notions it developed about how the world worked were not well grounded in evidence. Therefore, sociology attempts to answer four types of questions. So it will attempt to answer empirical research. And empirical research is explaining that sociology is a science, but it also looks at comparative. So it means that it may compare different things within society. Developmental, that may be seen as more as exploratory. We don't necessarily know the answers, or we're not really sure what we're going to find. So we're going to kind of test the water, so to say. It's still very rigorous. There's still rules in the way that you do exploratory research, but you don't necessarily have a theory that you are starting off with. And it can be theoretical, and that's where you're basically doing theory testing. So I mentioned about the idea that sociologists conduct two types of studies. They conduct qualitative and they conduct quantitative. Empirical research is both quantitative and qualitative research. Qualitative research can be things such as interviews, participant observations, or what we call ethnographic studies. That means that you're not collecting numbers. You're basically listening to what people are talking about. You're gathering that information and you're looking for trends or what we call themes to see if certain things are popping up out of the research that you see consistently over the groups that you've interviewed with or conducted the focus groups with, or even on surveys. You may have open-ended questions and you see different things that pop up on those open-ended questions. Quantitative research is going to be research that consists of numbers. So it's typically going to be something like surveys or questionnaires, maybe telephone polls. It's typically number-based, which is why you are interpreting the data. You use statistically sophisticated programs. So just remember, quantitative is going to be numerical based, qualitative is non-numerical based, but they're both empirical research. How does the research process look like, or what does the research process look like? For sociologists, we have two types. We can do inductive reasoning and we can do deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning, well, let me start off with inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is where you're letting the data guide the conclusion. You don't necessarily have a theory, and it's not theory driven. Now, this is not to say that you haven't done your literature review, you haven't collected information, or you haven't speculated about which theory your research may fall under. But if it doesn't fall under that theory, you're okay because you're not necessarily testing it. So typically what happens is that when you're doing inductive research, this will work fine. Even though I flipped the thing, this will work fine. You're normally going to start off with your observations first. And then you're going to do your generalizations. And then you arrive at a general theory. Or you may end up creating your own theory when you're doing inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning, let me flip back here. Deductive reasoning starts with the theory, starts with your research question. And you're going to look at your research design, collect your data, analyze your data, come up with your conclusion, and you want to see whether or not your data supports the theory, whether or not your findings are going to support the theory. With inductive reasoning, you still have your research questions, but this piece right here, the general theory, is not what's guiding the research. Normally what's going to be guiding your research is going to be your data. The data that you're collecting is going to guide your research and it'll get you to your conclusions. So let me give you an example of deductive reasoning. So there was a research study that was done, and the study was looking at whether or not Catholics are less likely than any other religious groups to support abortion rights. This would be deductive because of the Catholic doctrine that abortions are forbidden. However, the research findings showed something different. According to the research, this is not true. The survey showed that Catholics as a group are on an average more likely to support abortion rights than any other religious groups. So one of the things is that it started off with the general theory, hypothesis. Basically, the hypothesis would be that Catholics were less likely to support abortion rights. Then you've collected your data. Then you've analyzed your data. And then you come up with your findings from there. For inductive, one thing could be is maybe I wanted to study an unknown population or a population that wasn't very known. There's not a lot of literature on it. And so I maybe have a general theory. Maybe I have a general theory about this group, but I haven't developed any hypotheses because I don't have any information on there. But what I've done is I will go here and I will look at specific observations. Then I will look at my data, start analyzing my data. Sorry, my computer is very sensitive. Start analyzing my data. And then from there, I may end up being able to point to a theory. So hypothesis is a prediction or a hunch that a researcher intends to test. For example, let's say that I wanted to test whether or not students who study more than 3 hours pass the exam. So my hypothesis would be students who study more than 3 hours or more are able to pass the exam. That would be my hypothesis, okay? And then from there, I would look at my variables. And variables are going to be a characteristic that can have more than one value score. You normally have an independent variable and you have a dependent variable. So in this case, remember my hypothesis is students who study more than 4 hours will pass the exam. So my independent variable would be how many hours you studied, and my dependent variable would be the exam score. So my independent variable is going to presume the cause of the outcome. Therefore, studying more than 3 hours would be the presumed cause of the outcome, right? The dependent variable is going to be the effect, and the effect would be what your grade is on the exam if you studied more than 3 hours. Or, let's see, even if you study less than 3 hours, right? It would kind of predict that. Now we're going to look at the scientific method and the different steps that you take during the research process. So the first step is you're going to develop a research question. The second step is you're going to review the evidence. That's basically doing a literature review to see what information is out there. Your third step is that you're going to formulate a hypothesis, or you're going to develop additional research questions. The fourth step is that you would do your research design and gather your data. So you're designing and you're conducting a study. Your fifth step is going to be data analysis. Sixth is drawing a conclusion and you're going to report your findings. And then your seventh step is to repeat that. Don't worry, we're going to go through each one of these separately.